7 years ago, she was cast out of the castle in front of the entire court, humiliated, accused of betrayal, and carrying a secret no one would believe. The king she loved condemned her as a liar, and she disappeared into exile with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child growing in her womb. Now she's returned to the same castle that destroyed her, but she's not alone. The boy beside her has the king's storm-gray eyes, his dark curls, his unmistakable face, and every person who sees him knows exactly whose son he is. But Elena didn't come back for recognition or revenge. She came because the king is dying, wasting away from a mysterious illness that no physician can cure. And she knows something no one else does, something so devastating it could shatter the entire kingdom. The man the king trusted most, the uncle who guided him after her exile, has been poisoning him slowly for years. The same man who destroyed her life to seize power is now murdering the king in plain sight while the whole court watches, unseeing. Now Elena faces an impossible choice: save the man who destroyed her, or let him die and watch everything burn. Because if the king dies, her son, the rightful heir, becomes the next target, and the monster wearing a loyal uncle's face won't stop until he's eliminated every obstacle between himself and the throne. The iron gates of Thornhaven Castle groaned open after 7 years of silence, and Elena's hands trembled so violently she had to grip the reins until her knuckles turned white. The child beside her, Arthur, with his father's storm-gray eyes and that same stubborn jaw, asked why she was crying. But she couldn't answer because her throat had closed around words that tasted like ash and old wounds that never properly healed. She'd sworn she would never return to this place, sworn it on her mother's grave, sworn it on every humiliating tear she'd shed in the darkness of that terrible night when King Richard stood before the entire court and called her a whore. The word still lived in her bones, in the way she sometimes caught herself holding her breath when strangers looked at her too long, as if they could see the scarlet letter burned into her skin by a man who once whispered that she was his entire world. But Richard was dying, and despite everything, despite the public degradation, despite the 7 years of exile, despite the fact that her heart had shattered into so many pieces she'd stopped trying to count them, she couldn't let him die believing the lie that had destroyed them both. The castle courtyard buzzed with afternoon activity. Stable boys rushed to take horses, merchants hawked their wares near the kitchens, and servants hurried between stone buildings with linens and firewood. Nobody recognized her at first. She'd left as a girl of 19 with flowers in her hair and hope in her chest. She returned as a woman of 26 with shadows under her eyes and a child's small hand clutched desperately in hers. Then someone gasped. A kitchen maid dropped a basket of apples, the fruit rolling across cobblestones like small planets escaping orbit. Whispers erupted like fire catching dry wood. "That's her, Lady Elena. I thought she was dead." "Sweet Mary, look at the boy." Arthur pressed closer to her skirts, and Elena felt her son's fear vibrating through the fabric. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to get back on that horse, to protect her child from this place that had nearly killed her. But then she saw him. King Richard stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, and even from this distance, she could see how illness had carved him hollow. He'd been 20 when he destroyed her, broad-shouldered and vital, with color in his cheeks and that leonine confidence of young men who've never truly suffered. Now, at 27, he looked like something crucial had been slowly drained from him. His skin held a grayish pallor. His clothes hung looser than they should. And when their eyes met across the space of years and ruin, she watched his face cycle through disbelief, shock, and then something that looked horrifyingly like hope, before he caught himself, and his expression went carefully, devastatingly blank. Lord Regent Marcus appeared beside the king like a vulture sensing carrion. Richard's uncle had aged well, too well. While his nephew withered, Marcus seemed to have grown more robust, his silver hair thick and lustrous, his frame solid and healthy. He placed a hand on Richard's shoulder with the possessive familiarity of someone who'd long ago stopped asking permission, And Elena felt her stomach twist because she remembered that hand, remembered it gripping her arm the night before her public humiliation, remembered his voice in her ear. "You will not trap my nephew with a base-born child. This ends tomorrow." She'd tried to tell Richard about his uncle's threats, but there'd been no time. The next morning, Marcus had presented his evidence, a letter supposedly written by her to Sir Garrett, the young knight who'd served as her escort during the harvest festival. The letter detailed an affair, complete with intimate knowledge that made Elena's skin crawl, because she'd never written those words, never touched Garrett beyond formal courtesy, never betrayed Richard even in thought. But the letter existed. The handwriting looked enough like hers. And Garrett, when brought before the court, had gone pale as death and said nothing to defend either of them before being dragged away to the dungeons. She'd screamed Richard's name, begged him to listen, reached for him across the throne room while guards held her back, and he'd looked at her with eyes turned to ice and said, "Remove this deceitful woman from my sight. I never want to see her face again." The child shifted beside her, pulling her back to the present. Arthur's resemblance to Richard was unmistakable. The same gray eyes, the same dark hair. That curled at the nape of his neck, the same way of tilting his head when confused. Every person in this courtyard could see it. She watched the recognition ripple through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Marcus descended the stairs with measured steps, and Elena's heart hammered against her ribs because she knew he was the one poisoning Richard. She'd figured it out 6 months ago, when a traveling merchant had passed through her small coastal village with stories of the young king's mysterious illness, how it had started slowly 2 years after his marriage, how no physician could identify the cause, how he grew weaker each season while his uncle grew stronger in his stead, making decisions, signing decrees, consolidating power. She'd remembered then the way Marcus always insisted on serving Richard's wine himself, the way he'd been so eager to remove anyone who truly loved his nephew, the way he'd maneuvered Richard into a political marriage with Lady Catherine, a sweet, timid girl from a minor house who'd never challenged Marcus's authority. Elena had spent months gathering what information she could. She'd tracked down the apothecary who'd fled Thornhaven 3 years ago, the one who'd sold Marcus small amounts of white arsenic disguised as stomach remedies. She'd found records of similar deaths in Marcus's past. His own brother, Richard's father, had died of a wasting sickness, remarkably similar to what now plagued the king. She had fragments of proof, not enough to accuse a Lord Regent publicly, but enough to start asking the right questions. "Lady Elena." Marcus's voice dripped false courtesy as he reached her. "What an unexpected resurrection. We'd heard you died of shame." Arthur's hand tightened in hers. She forced herself to meet Marcus's eyes and saw the cold calculation there, the quick assessment of threat level. He was wondering why she'd come back, wondering what she wanted. Good. Let him wonder. Let him make mistakes. "I've come to see the king," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd hoped. "I have information regarding his illness." Something flickered across Marcus's face, too quick to read, but she caught it. Fear? Anger? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "His Majesty is not receiving visitors, especially not those who've caused him such pain." "Then perhaps he should know," Elena said quietly, loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear, "that the pain he's experiencing isn't from old heartbreak. It's from poison, and it's killing him slowly while everyone watches." The courtyard went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's smile froze on his face, but his eyes went dark with something murderous. On the balcony above, Richard swayed slightly, gripping the stone railing. His face had gone from gray to white, and Arthur, her beautiful boy who looked so much like his dying father, asked in a voice that carried across the sudden quiet, "Mama, why is everyone staring at us?" The throne room felt smaller than Elena remembered, or perhaps she'd simply grown larger in her grief. 7 years ago, she'd knelt on these same cold stones while Richard condemned her, and now she stood, spine straight, chin lifted, because she'd promised herself she would never kneel to anyone again. Arthur pressed against her side. His small fingers twisted in the fabric of her travel-worn cloak, and she could feel his heart racing through the layers of cloth between them. Richard sat slumped in his throne like a puppet with half its strings cut. Up close, the deterioration was even more apparent. Purple shadows pooled beneath his eyes, deep as bruises. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped the armrests, and Elena noticed how his rings, the heavy signet of kingship, the band of woven gold his father had worn, hung loose on fingers that had grown too thin. She'd traced those hands once in the darkness of the rose garden, memorizing each callus from sword practice, each scar from childhood adventures. Now they looked like they belonged to a stranger slowly disappearing. Lord Regent Marcus stood 3 steps below the throne, positioned perfectly to appear subservient while actually controlling the room's entire geometry. He'd changed into formal robes since the courtyard, deep crimson trimmed with ermine, the colors of royal authority he had no birthright to wear. His performance of concern was masterful, furrowed brow, hands clasped in apparent distress, voice pitched to convey wounded dignity. "Your Majesty, this woman arrives after 7 years of exile, making wild accusations. Surely you see this for what it is, a desperate attempt to manipulate your sympathies using an unfortunate child who bears a passing resemblance." Passing. The word escaped Elena's throat like something with claws. She stepped forward before the guards could stop her, and Arthur stumbled with her, his eyes going wide. "Look at him. Every person in that courtyard saw it. Every servant whispering in the halls knows it. This child is your nephew, Marcus, whether you acknowledge it or not." Richard's gaze fixed on Arthur with an intensity that made Elena's chest constrict. She watched him catalog each feature. The storm-gray eyes that mirrored his own, the dark curls, the slight cleft in the chin that had marked 3 generations of his family. The king's throat worked as he swallowed, and for a moment, his carefully constructed mask cracked, to reveal something raw and devastating underneath. "How old?" Richard's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. 7 this past winter." Elena's hands shook, so she gripped Arthur's shoulders to still them. "Conceived the night of the Harvest Moon Festival. Born in a fishing village 200 miles from here, where I fled after you." Her voice broke. She forced it steady again. "After you cast me out." The mathematics hung in the air between them. 7 years ago. 1 month before the public accusation. 3 months before Richard's forced marriage to Lady Catherine. The timeline aligned perfectly, damning and irrefutable. Marcus moved with practiced ease, inserting himself between Elena and the throne. Convenient timing for such a revelation. The king falls ill, succession becomes uncertain, and suddenly a former mistress appears with a child who could be anyone's. Anyone's. Elena's laugh tasted bitter. "You know the truth, Marcus. You've always known it. Just like you knew that letter was a forgery. Just like you knew Sir Garrett was innocent when you had him thrown in the dungeons." She watched Marcus's jaw tighten, saw the muscle jump beneath his carefully trimmed beard. Good. She was getting under his skin. "Sir Garrett confessed to the affair," Marcus said smoothly, but Elena caught the edge in his voice now. "Garrett said nothing. There's a difference between silence and confession." Elena took another step forward. The guards tensed, hands moving toward you. Sword hilts, but Richard raised one trembling hand to stop them. "I spent years wondering why he wouldn't defend himself, why he'd let both our reputations burn without speaking a single word. Then I realized, you threatened someone he loved. His mother, perhaps? His younger sister who was sick that season. What did you promise would happen to them if he opened his mouth?" The color drained from Marcus's face for just an instant before he recovered. But Elena had seen it. That flicker of recognition, that confirmation. Richard leaned forward in his throne, and the movement seemed to cost him. His breathing had gone shallow, rapid. "Is this true, Uncle?" "Your Majesty, you cannot possibly give credence to the ravings of a scorned woman. I asked you a question. Richard's voice carried an echo of the authority he'd once wielded so naturally before illness and manipulation had whittled him down. "Did you threaten Garrett's family?" Marcus's pause lasted half a second too long. "I did what was necessary to protect you from a manipulative girl who sought to trap you into marriage through pregnancy. Everything I have done has been for the preservation of this kingdom and your sacred position. By poisoning him." Elena's words cut through the throne room like a blade. "By slowly draining his life while you consolidate power. How long has it been, Marcus? 2 years? 3? Small doses of white arsenic in his wine, carefully measured so the decline appears natural. So, nobody questions why a healthy young king suddenly wastes away while his uncle blooms with health." The throne room erupted. Courtiers gasped and whispered. Guards exchanged uncertain glances. Richard gripped his armrests so hard his knuckles went white, and Elena saw him fighting to draw breath, saw the tremor that ran through his entire frame. Marcus's mask finally shattered, his face twisted with rage, with calculation, with the dangerous intelligence of a man whose careful plans had been suddenly threatened. "You have no proof. You spin wild theories based on nothing but spite and jealousy. I have the testimony of an apothecary who fled Thornhaven 3 years ago, the same man who sold you white arsenic disguised as stomach remedies." Elena pulled a folded parchment from inside her cloak. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. "I have records of similar deaths in your past. Your brother, Richard's father, died of identical symptoms 7 years before Richard took the throne. And I have this." She held up a small vial filled with pale liquid. Every eye in the room locked onto it. Wine from the king's private stores, taken from his chambers 2 days ago by someone who owed me a debt. Elena met Richard's eyes across the space between them, and something passed between them that hurt worse than the original betrayal. "Test it. Have your physicians examine it. You'll find traces of arsenic, carefully measured to sicken but not immediately kill. The perfect murder, stretched across years, disguised as mysterious illness." Richard tried to stand and couldn't. His legs buckled, and he collapsed back into the throne with a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Arthur whimpered and buried his face in Elena's skirts, overwhelmed by the adult anguish swirling around him. Marcus stepped toward her with murder in his eyes. "You lying, manipulative guards." Richard's voice cracked like a whip despite its weakness. "Arrest Lord Regent Marcus on suspicion of attempted regicide. Confine him to the Northern Tower until this matter can be properly investigated." For one crystalline moment, Elena thought Marcus would actually try to fight. His hand moved toward his belt, toward the ceremonial dagger he wore. But 6 guards surrounded him, and even he wasn't foolish enough to start a battle he couldn't win. As they led him away, Marcus locked eyes with Elena. The promise in that gaze was clear. This wasn't over, not by half. Richard slumped in his throne, looking more dead than alive. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Take the boy somewhere safe. We'll speak privately at sunset." He paused, and the next word seemed to cost him everything. "Please." That single word, "please," from the man who'd once commanded her removal without mercy, shattered something inside Elena's chest that she'd thought was already broken beyond repair. The rose garden had died in her absence. Elena stood among the skeletal bushes at sunset, there. Thorns dark and twisted like arthritic fingers reaching toward a sky bleeding orange and purple. 7 years ago, this garden had been her sanctuary, cascading blooms of crimson and white, the air thick with perfume, stone benches worn smooth by generations of lovers seeking privacy among the petals. Now the bushes were overgrown and neglected, choked by weeds, as if the garden itself had mourned when she left and never recovered. Arthur was safe in the servants' quarters with Mary, an older kitchen woman who'd been kind to Elena once, lifetimes ago. The boy had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the journey and the strange terror of the throne room. Elena had watched him sleep for 20 minutes, memorizing the rise and fall of his small chest, the way his hand curled near his face exactly like Richard's did. She'd wanted to stay there, wrapped in the simple safety of her child's breathing. But Richard had summoned her, and despite everything, despite the fury and hurt and betrayal that still lived like shrapnel in her heart, she'd come. She heard him before she saw him. The scrape of boots on stone, irregular and unsteady. The catch in his breathing. When Richard emerged from behind the dead rose arbor, he looked like a man walking to his own execution. He'd changed from his formal robes into simpler clothes, a linen shirt, dark breeches, boots worn soft with use. Without the trappings of kingship, he looked younger, more like the boy she'd loved before crowns. And uncles and poison had twisted everything into something unrecognizable. They stood 10 feet apart, separated by dead garden and 7 years of ruin. Elena's hands clenched at her sides because her body remembered how to reach for him, and she hated that muscle memory. Hated that even now some traitorous part of her wanted to close the distance and touch him, just to confirm he was real and dying and still somehow the same person who'd once made her believe in impossible things. "You should sit," she said, because he was swaying slightly, and her instinct to care for him was apparently unkillable. "If I sit, I'm not certain I'll be able to stand again." Richard's voice carried dark humor that didn't reach his eyes. "These days my body is more obstacle than ally." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. A crow called from somewhere beyond the garden walls, harsh and mocking. The dying light turned Richard's face into a landscape of shadows, making the hollows beneath his cheekbones look like valleys carved by suffering. "Is it true?" he finally asked. "The poison?" "Yes." Elena's throat tightened. "I believe it started roughly 2 years after your marriage to Lady Catherine. Small doses, carefully administered. White arsenic causes symptoms that mimic common ailments: fatigue, digestive troubles, weakness. Easy to mistake for stress or natural illness." Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I trusted him. After what happened. Marcus was the only person I could rely on. He guided me through the marriage negotiations, the treaties, the endless politics of ruling. When I started feeling unwell, he was the one who brought physicians, who sat with me through the worst nights, who—" His voice broke. "Christ, he's been killing me while holding my hand." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, fighting the urge to go to him. "Your father died the same way. I found records. The same mysterious wasting sickness. The same progression of symptoms. Marcus has been planning this for over a decade." "Why?" Richard's eyes met hers, and the anguish there made her breath catch. "Why go to such lengths? He already has power, wealth, influence. Why murder his own family? Because almost enough is never enough for men like him. As Lord Regent, he rules through you, but he can never truly be king while you live." Elena took a single step closer, drawn by the gravity of his pain despite herself. "And you were always too strong-willed, too principled. Eventually, you would have seen through him. So he made sure you'd never get the chance." Richard pressed his palm against his chest, fingers spreading over his heart, as if he could physically hold himself together. "The night I condemned you. The letter, the evidence, Marcus's certainty that you'd betrayed me. I was so angry, so hurt. I wanted to believe you'd never do such a thing, but the proof seemed irrefutable. And Garrett's silence felt like confirmation. He threatened Garrett's sister." Elena's voice came out flat, drained of emotion. "She was 12 years old and dying of consumption. Marcus promised that if Garrett spoke one word in our defense, he'd have the girl thrown out of the castle infirmary to die in the streets. Garrett chose his sister's life over his honor, over mine. I can't even hate him for it." Richard's legs finally gave out. He sank onto the stone bench behind him with a gracefulness that came from long practice at hiding weakness. His hands shook where they gripped the edge of the seat. "I destroyed you for nothing, cast you out, humiliated you publicly, made you an outcast, all while following a script my uncle had written." "Yes." The word tasted like poison itself. And you were pregnant. Richard's gaze moved to where the servants' quarters stood beyond the garden walls, where Arthur slept. You carried my child while I called you a whore and banished you from the only home you'd ever known. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough for this man, for this kingdom, for the girl she'd been who believed love could conquer politics and power. I tried to tell you. The morning after the harvest festival, I came to your chambers. I wanted to share the news, to see your face when I told you we'd created a life together. But Marcus was already there, poisoning your mind before I could speak. What did you do? Richard asked quietly. Where did you go? North, at first, then to the coast. Elena's voice steadied as she retreated into facts, into the safe territory of logistics. I found work in a fishing village, mending nets, cleaning fish, anything that would put food in my mouth and a roof over my head. I gave birth alone in a one-room cottage during a winter storm. Arthur almost died in his first week. Fever. I had no money for a physician, so I prayed to every saint I could remember while wrapping him in rags soaked in cool water. Richard's face had gone gray again, but not from poison this time. From guilt, from the accumulating weight of consequences. He lived. Elena forced herself to continue. He grew strong and curious and kind. He asks about his father sometimes. I've never known what to tell him. The truth seemed too cruel, that his father loved his mother once but chose to believe a lie instead. That his father sent his mother away to die without ever asking for her side of the story. Elena. Richard's voice cracked completely. But I also couldn't tell him his father was evil, because you're not. You were manipulated by someone who spent years perfecting the art of controlling you. You were 20 years old, freshly crowned, drowning in responsibility, and your uncle was a master strategist who knew exactly which emotional strings to pull. Elena wiped roughly at her eyes. I've spent 7 years hating you and understanding you in equal measure. Some days the hate wins, others the understanding. Today I honestly don't know which I feel more. Richard stood with visible effort, closing half the distance between them. Close enough now that she could see the fine tremor in his hands, smell the medicinal herbs that clung to his clothes, count the silver threads beginning to weave through his dark hair. Why did you come back? You could have stayed away, kept Arthur safe from all of this. Why risk everything to warn me about Marcus? The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Elena knew her answer would determine everything that came next, whether Richard lived or died, whether Arthur ever knew his father, whether she could salvage anything from the wreckage Marcus had made of all their lives. Because, she said slowly, each word costing her, I realized that letting you die without knowing the truth would make me just as much a murderer as Marcus. And because Arthur deserves to know his father, not the king, not the man who condemned his mother, but the actual human being underneath the crown. Even if that man is flawed and dying and imperfect. She paused, and the next words came from some deep, aching place she'd tried to wall off for 7 years. And because some foolish part of me still remembers the boy who taught me to read star charts in this garden, who brought me wildflowers because roses seemed too formal, who promised me once that he would always choose truth over convenience. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I came back because I needed to know if any part of that boy still existed. Richard reached toward her face, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. I don't deserve your mercy. No, Elena agreed. You don't. But Arthur deserves a father, and this kingdom deserves a king who isn't a murderer. So we'll save you despite yourself, and you'll spend the rest of your life, however long that is, trying to become worthy of a second chance you should never have been given. A sound made them both turn. A figure stood at the garden entrance, backlit by torches from the castle. Lady Catherine, Richard's wife, watched them with an expression Elena couldn't read, neither jealous nor angry, but something more complex and calculating. Your Majesty, Catherine said softly, the physicians are asking for you. Your evening medication is prepared. Richard and Elena locked eyes, and Elena saw the realization hit him like a physical blow. His evening medication. Prepared by whom? Administered by whom? How deep did Marcus's conspiracy run? Lady Catherine's chambers smelled of lavender and something else Elena couldn't quite identify. Something medicinal and sharp that caught in the back of her throat. The Queen sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned early that visibility meant vulnerability. She was smaller than Elena remembered from 7 years ago, more fragile, with the kind of delicate beauty that made men want to protect her and underestimate her in equal measure. Elena stood near the door, every muscle tense, while Richard paced the length of the room like a caged animal fighting against the bars of his own failing body. He'd refused his evening medication, had ordered the physicians away with a vehemence that left them stammering and confused. Now the three of them occupied this strange tableau, king, exiled lover, and lawful wife, dancing around truths that could destroy what remained of the kingdom. "How long have you known?" Richard's question cut through the silence like a blade. He stopped pacing to face Catherine, and even weakened by poison, he carried an authority that made the air feel heavier. "About the arsenic. About my uncle." "How long?" Catherine's face remained perfectly composed, but Elena saw her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly in her lap. "I suspected for approximately 18 months. I became certain 6 months ago when I discovered Lord Marcus visiting the apothecary in the lower city. The same apothecary who'd provided stomach remedies for your father before his death." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Richard's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like betrayal made fresh. 18 months. You've known someone was murdering me for 18 months and said nothing. What would you have had me say? Catherine's voice remained soft, but steel ran underneath it now. "I'm a political bride from a minor house with no allies at court. Marcus controls the guard, the council, half the nobility. If I'd accused him without irrefutable proof, I would have disappeared into a convent or suffered an unfortunate accident. My silence kept me alive and positioned to act when the moment came." Elena found herself reassessing the woman before her. This wasn't the timid girl she'd imagined, the passive wife who'd simply taken Elena's place in Richard's bed and life. This was someone who'd been playing a dangerous game of survival in a court where one wrong move meant death. "And you waited for me." Elena's words came out as statement rather than question. "You knew I'd eventually figure it out. That's why you had someone take that wine sample from Richard's chambers and ensure it reached me." Catherine's eyes met hers, and Elena saw recognition pass between them. Two women who'd been used as pawns in Marcus's game, both finding ways to fight back with the limited weapons available to them. "The merchant who visited your village 6 months ago with stories of the king's illness. He worked for me. I needed someone from outside Marcus's sphere of influence. Someone with motivation to investigate. Someone Richard had once loved enough to actually listen to." Richard sank into a chair, his face ashen. "You've been orchestrating this entire confrontation?" "Someone had to." Catherine rose gracefully, moving to a small wooden chest on her desk. She produced a leather journal, its pages thick with careful script. "I've documented everything. Every time Marcus insisted on serving your wine personally. Every suspicious death among those who might have questioned his authority. Every financial irregularity suggesting he's been siphoning funds to secure loyalties." She placed the journal on the table between them. "But documentation means nothing without someone willing to stand before the court and make accusations. I couldn't do it. I'm just the foreign bride many nobles already resent. Elena could. She's the wronged woman returning with proof of your heir. She has nothing left to lose and everything to gain." Elena felt the manipulation of it settle over her like a heavy cloak. "You used me. Used my son. I gave you an opportunity for justice," Catherine corrected quietly. "And I gave Richard a chance at survival. Was I supposed to simply watch my husband waste away while his murderer consolidated power? Should I have remained silent while Marcus positioned himself to rule through any child I might bear?" The word struck Elena oddly. "Any child you might bear?" You've been married to Richard for nearly 7 years. Surely, Catherine's laugh was bitter and sharp. There are herbs one can take. Preventatives. I've consumed them faithfully since our wedding night. She looked at Richard with something that might have been regret or relief. I won't bring a child into this world to be used as Marcus's puppet. Better to remain barren, and useless than to provide him with another pawn. Richard's expression cracked completely. Catherine, I never knew you felt. How could you know? You were too busy dying and too manipulated to see the prison Marcus built around both of us. Catherine's voice softened slightly. I don't blame you, Richard. You were 20 years old when we married, grief-stricken over your father's death, confused by Elena's apparent betrayal, desperate for guidance. Marcus offered you certainty in a world that had become chaos. Of course you clung to him. Elena watched the exchange with a strange ache in her chest. This wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the recognition that Catherine had lived 7 years in a marriage poisoned by Marcus's influence, had watched the man she'd been bound to slowly dying while playing the perfect, submissive queen to survive. They were both victims of the same architect of ruin. The guard, Elena said suddenly, her mind racing ahead. Marcus controls the castle guard. Even with him arrested, his influence runs deep. The moment we move against him openly, his loyalists will react. Not all the guard. Catherine returned to her desk, producing another document. Captain Werner suspects something. He's grown increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's orders over the past year, and there are 6 other guards, men who served Richard's father, who remember the old king's kindness, who would stand with us if given proof and leadership. Richard struggled. To his feet, some of his old determination flickering through the weakness. We need to test the remaining wine stores, publicly. If we can prove the poison exists exactly where Marcus had access, he'll claim it was planted by Elena, Catherine interrupted. His defense will be that the scorned woman returned seeking revenge, fabricating evidence to frame an innocent man. Half the court will believe him simply because they benefit from his patronage. Elena's mind worked through the problem, like untangling fishing nets. Then we need Garrett, Sir Garrett. If he's still alive in the dungeons, if we can get him to testify about Marcus's threats, he's dead. Catherine's words fell like stones into still water. Died 3 years ago. Prison fever, according to official records. But he was perfectly healthy when I had servants check on him 2 weeks before his death. The timing coincided with Marcus securing a particularly important alliance with the Duke of Westmarch. Garrett knew too much and had outlived his usefulness as a cautionary tale. The room went silent, except for Richard's labored breathing. Elena felt rage building in her chest, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating fury that had sustained her through 7 years of exile. Marcus had destroyed so many lives with such casual cruelty, had built his empire on a foundation of corpses and broken people. The apothecary, Elena said finally, the one who fled Thornhaven 3 years ago. I found him. In a coastal town, terrified Marcus would track him down. He'll testify. He kept records of every sale, including the arsenic purchases. Can we trust him not to run the moment Marcus's people come asking questions? Richard's skepticism was warranted. He has a daughter, 10 years old, sick with the same lung condition that's killing her slowly. I've been paying for her treatment. Elena met Richard's eyes. He'll testify because I'll promise to continue that care. Because his daughter deserves to live more than he deserves to stay hidden. Catherine nodded slowly. That could work, if we move quickly before Marcus can organize his defense. We'll need to present everything at once. The testimony, the wine analysis, my documentation, Elena's evidence about Richard's father. Overwhelm the court with proof before anyone can construct counter-narratives. And Arthur. Richard's voice was barely audible. My son. What happens to him in all of this? Elena's protective instincts flared immediately. He stays out of court politics. I won't have him used as leverage or put in danger. I meant, Richard interrupted gently. What happens after? When Marcus is dealt with and the kingdom knows the truth. Arthur is my heir, my only acknowledged child. Catherine has ensured there will be no others. That boy sleeping in the servants' quarters is the future of this kingdom, whether we planned it or not. The weight of that reality settled over all three of them. Arthur, conceived in love, born in exile, raised in poverty, would suddenly become the most important child in the realm. Every faction would want to control him, to shape him, to use him for their own purposes. Then we protect him. Catherine spoke with quiet conviction. All three of us. We put aside whatever grievances and complications exist between us, and we make sure that boy grows up safe and whole and good. We give him what none of us had, a childhood free from manipulation and poison. Helena looked. Between them, the dying king who'd destroyed her, the queen who'd survived through calculation, and felt something shift in her understanding of possible futures. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something more pragmatic and perhaps more honest. An alliance forged from mutual damage and shared purpose. Tomorrow, Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. We move tomorrow. Before I get any weaker, before Marcus can organize his defenses, we bring everything before the full court and let justice finally have its say. A knock at the door made all three of them freeze. A servant's voice called through the wood. Your Majesty, urgent news from the northern tower. Lord Marcus has taken ill. The guards say he's asking for a priest and requesting to see you one final time before he dies. The northern tower smelled of damp stone and desperation. Elena climbed the spiral stairs behind Richard and Catherine, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that screamed danger with each beat. Captain Werner led them, his hand resting on his sword hilt with the vigilance of a man who'd finally chosen which side of history he wanted to stand on. Two other guards followed behind, the loyal ones Catherine had identified, men whose faces carried the grim determination of those who'd seen too much corruption and finally found permission to act against it. Marcus lay on the narrow bed in his cell, and Elena's first thought was that he'd aged 20 years in the span of hours. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, sweat beaded across his forehead, and his breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. A priest knelt beside the bed, murmuring prayers that sounded like water running over stones, constant and meaningless in their repetition. But Elena had spent 7 years gutting fish and mending nets alongside people who worked with their hands and survived by reading the truth beneath surfaces. She saw the way Marcus's eyes tracked their entrance, with perfect clarity despite his supposedly weakened state. Saw how his trembling hands stilled for just a fraction of a second when Richard approached. Saw the calculation hiding beneath the performance of a dying man seeking absolution. Uncle. Richard's voice carried layers of emotion Elena couldn't untangle. Grief, rage, betrayal, and something that might have been desperate hope that this was all somehow a terrible misunderstanding. What's happened? The guards said you'd fallen ill. Poison. Marcus's voice came out as a rasp, but Elena caught the practiced quality of it. Someone slipped something into my evening meal. I should have known. Should have been more careful. His eyes found Elena's face, and she saw cold fury there, quickly masked. When you make accusations against powerful people, they find ways to silence you. The implication landed like a stone in still water. Elena felt Catherine stiffen beside her, felt the guards shift uneasily. Marcus was already constructing his narrative, painting himself as the victim, suggesting Elena had attempted to murder him to prevent him from defending himself against her accusations. How convenient, Elena said quietly, stepping forward before Richard could respond. That you'd fall ill from poison just hours after being accused of the same crime. Almost as if you'd anticipated the need for a compelling counter-narrative. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for just an instant, the mask slipped completely. She saw the predator underneath, the strategist who'd spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation. Then he coughed, a wet, painful sound that seemed genuine enough, and blood flecked his lips. The priest made the sign of the cross and backed away, his face pale. He needs last rites. If your Majesty would allow me to hear his confession in private. No. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. Whatever my uncle has to say, he'll say it before witnesses. There have been enough secrets. Enough. Whispered confessions that disappear into the darkness. If Marcus is truly dying, then he can face his maker with truth spoken aloud. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Frustration, perhaps, or recalculation. He'd wanted the privacy of confession, wanted the chance to spin one final web of manipulation through the priest, who would then carry carefully crafted deathbed truths to the court. Richard had just closed that door. Very well. Marcus struggled to sit up, and this time, Elena thought the weakness might actually be real. I have much to confess. The guilt has eaten at me for years. He paused, his gaze sweeping across each face in the room. I killed your father, Richard, the old king. It was poison, administered slowly over months. I told myself it was necessary, that he was making choices that would destroy the kingdom, that I was saving us all. The confession should have felt like victory. Instead, Elena's instincts screamed warning. This was too easy, too convenient. Marcus was admitting to one murder while carefully avoiding another. And Elena? Richard's voice shook. The accusations against her? The forged letter? All true, I'm afraid. Marcus coughed again, more blood appearing at the corners of his mouth. She was exactly what she claimed. Innocent, faithful, carrying your child. I manufactured the evidence because I needed you married to Catherine, needed the political alliance her family provided. I threatened Sir Garrett's sister, made him choose between his honor and his family's life. His eyes filled with tears that looked almost genuine. I've done terrible things in service of what I believed was a greater good, but I never... He paused, his breathing becoming more labored. I never poisoned you, Richard. That accusation is false. I love you like my own son. Everything I did, every manipulation, was to secure your throne and protect your kingdom. Elena felt the trap closing like jaws around them. Marcus was confessing to old crimes while denying the current one, painting himself as a tragic figure who'd made terrible choices out of misguided love rather than a calculating murderer actively trying to steal the throne. He was dying anyway, or appearing to, so the confession cost him nothing. But by denying Richard's poisoning, he was casting doubt on Elena's accusations and positioning her as the actual threat. The wine, Elena said urgently, turning to Richard. The sample I brought. Have it tested now in front of witnesses. That's proof. Proof that someone put arsenic in wine. Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining unexpected strength. But proof of who? You had access to the king's chambers through your relationship with His Majesty. You had motive, revenge for your exile. You return after 7 years with a child you claim is the king's heir, and suddenly I'm accused of the very crime you yourself might be committing. Catherine stepped forward, her soft voice cutting through the tension. Then, explain the documentation I've kept. The pattern of your behavior, the financial records, the witnesses who saw you with the apothecary. Documentation can be fabricated. Marcus's eyes locked on Catherine with something that looked like disappointment but felt like threat. You never liked me, dear niece. You resented my influence over your husband, my position in the kingdom. How convenient for you to ally with his former lover against me. 2 women scorned, working together to remove the one person who stood between them and control of a dying king. The strategy was brilliant and devastating. Marcus was using society's existing prejudices, the suspicion of women's motives, the assumption of female manipulation, the belief that scorned women were capable of any deception, to turn their evidence against them. Even dying or appearing to die, he was fighting with every weapon he'd spent decades sharpening. Richard swayed on his feet, and Elena saw the poison working through him in real time. The trembling hands, the gray pallor, the way his breathing had gone shallow. He was running out of time and strength, and Marcus knew it. Every moment they spent in this cell was a moment Richard grew weaker, less able to lead the confrontation Marcus's confession had been designed to forestall. Captain Werner, Richard said, his voice barely steady, remove the priest. I want guards stationed outside this cell with orders that no one, absolutely no one, enters without my direct command. No meals, no visitors, no priests offering comfort. Marcus stays here, alive or dying, until we can properly investigate every accusation from all sides. Werner moved immediately, ushering the protesting priest toward the door. Marcus watched the captain with an expression that promised retribution, and Elena realized with a chill that even now, even arrested and apparently dying, Marcus had allies among the guard. Werner might be loyal, but how many others still answered to the Lord Regent? As they turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped them. "Richard, nephew, one last thing." He coughed, and this time the blood seemed darker, more copious. "The boy, Arthur, whatever happens to me, whatever truth emerges, he's innocent in all of this. Promise me you'll protect him. Promise me that child won't pay for the sins of those who made him a pawn." The manipulation was masterful, appealing to Richard's sense of honor, positioning Marcus as someone who cared about Arthur's welfare, subtly suggesting that Elena might be using her own child as a weapon in her quest for revenge. Elena saw Richard wavering, saw the doubt Marcus's words had planted. She stepped closer to Richard, close enough to speak softly so only he could hear. "He's trying to divide us, trying to make you question everything, including your own son. That's what he does. He finds the weak points in people's certainty and wedges them open until everything collapses. Don't let him do it again." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They left the cell in silence, the sound of Marcus's labored breathing following them down the spiral stairs like a curse. In the corridor below, Richard finally stopped, bracing himself against the stone wall. His whole body shook with exhaustion and something deeper, the accumulated weight of betrayals layered upon betrayals, truth mixed with lies until nothing felt solid anymore. "I don't know what's real," he whispered. "I can't trust my own perceptions. Everything I thought I knew about my uncle, about you, about my father's death, it's all shifting sand. How am I supposed to rule when I can't even determine basic truth?" Catherine placed a hand on his arm, her touch careful and formal. "Then we find objective proof. We test the wine, we bring in the apothecary, we examine financial records and testimonies until the evidence is overwhelming enough that even doubt can't survive it." "And if Marcus truly is dying?" Elena asked the question none of them wanted to voice. "If his illness is genuine and he dies before we can prove anything definitively, we're left with his confession to old crimes and his denial of new ones. The court will be divided, the kingdom will fracture, and Arthur," her voice caught, "Arthur will grow up in a kingdom that can't agree on whether his mother is a victim or a murderer." A sound echoed from somewhere deep in the castle, metal on stone, rhythmic and purposeful. Captain Werner's hand went to his sword. "That's coming." From the armory. At this hour, no one should be. The explosion cut off his words, not loud, but definitive. The sound of something important breaking. Smoke began to curl through the corridors, carrying the acrid smell of burning parchment and leather. The records room. Catherine's face went white. "All my documentation, the financial records, everything." They ran, Richard stumbling between Elena and Werner, guards shouting behind them. But Elena already knew what they'd find. Marcus hadn't been dying. He'd been buying time, keeping them occupied in the northern tower, while his remaining loyalists destroyed evidence and eliminated threats. The game wasn't over. It had only just entered its most dangerous phase. The records room was a tomb of ash and smoke. Elena stood in the doorway, watching 7 years of Catherine's careful documentation curl into black nothing, feeling the heat of destruction against her face like a physical slap. The flames had been expertly set, not wild and consuming, but precise and surgical, targeting specific shelves where the Queen had hidden her evidence while leaving enough of the room intact to appear accidental rather than deliberate sabotage. Catherine pushed past the guards, heedless of the danger, and Elena watched something break in the Queen's carefully maintained composure. She dropped to her knees among the smoking debris, her hands frantically sorting through charred parchment that disintegrated at her touch. "No, no, no." The word became a chant, desperate and raw. 3 years of work. Every transaction, every witness statement, every pattern I documented. Was this all of it? Richard's question cut through Catherine's spiral. He swayed where he stood, one hand braced against the doorframe, his face the color of old parchment. Did you keep copies? Hide documentation elsewhere? Catherine's laugh was jagged with hysteria. I kept it all here because this was the safest place I could access without arousing Marcus's suspicion. The Queen's records room, protected by guards I thought were loyal, locked with keys only I possessed. She held up her hand, and Elena saw the key ring still dangling from her fingers. They didn't need to steal my keys. They just needed me distracted long enough to do their work. Captain Werner appeared in the corridor, his face grim, dragging a young guard who couldn't have been more than 18. The boy's face was streaked with soot, his hands trembling. Found him trying to leave through the kitchen courtyard. He smells like lamp oil and guilt. I didn't have a choice, the boy stammered, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. Lord Marcus, he has my mother working in the castle laundry. He said if I didn't help, she'd be accused of theft and hanged. He said it was just old papers, nothing important, that he was protecting the king from false accusations. Where is he? Elena stepped forward, and something in her voice made the young guard flinch. Marcus, he's not dying in that cell, is he? This was all theater to keep us busy while his people moved. The boy's silence was answer enough. Werner shook him roughly. Where? The Eastern Chapel, the guard finally whispered. There's a passage behind the altar that leads to the old catacombs. He was going to wait there until his supporters could organize, then he stopped, his eyes going wide with the realization of what he'd just betrayed. Richard moved with surprising speed for someone so weakened, grabbing the boy by his collar. Then what? What was he planning? A trial, the guard gasped. A formal trial before the full court tomorrow at midday. He said the evidence would speak for itself, that Lady Elena would be revealed as a vengeful woman making false accusations, that Queen Catherine had been manipulated by her, that you were too ill to see the truth. He said he'd be exonerated, and then, the boy's voice dropped to barely audible. Then he'd petition to be named regent until you recovered or until a proper heir could be established. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Marcus wasn't trying to escape. He was positioning for a public spectacle where he'd control the narrative completely. With Catherine's documentation destroyed, with Richard visibly weakened by poison, with Elena cast as the scorned woman seeking revenge, Marcus would paint himself as the loyal uncle protecting a sick king from manipulation. Arthur. The name ripped from Elena's throat. She turned and ran, not waiting for the others, her feet flying over stone floors while her heart threatened to tear itself apart. The servants' quarters felt miles away instead of minutes, and every shadow seemed to hide threat. Every corner held potential ambush. Mary, the kitchen woman, stood outside the door to the small room where Arthur slept. Her face was pale, and she gripped a heavy iron poker in both hands like a weapon. Lady Elena, thank God, there were men asking. About the boy not 10 minutes past. Strange men I didn't recognize, wearing guard uniforms but moving wrong, looking wrong. I sent them away, said the child was with the Queen, but they'll be back. Elena pushed past her into the room. Arthur sat up in the narrow bed, his dark hair wild from sleep, his gray eyes, Richard's eyes, wide with fear he was too young to fully understand. Mama, what's happening? Why is everyone shouting? She gathered him into her arms, feeling his small body trembling, smelling the little boy's scent of him that was soap and sleep and innocence. We're leaving, sweetheart. Right now. We're going somewhere safe. But you said we'd stay. You said I'd meet my father. Arthur's voice cracked with confusion and hurt, and Elena felt her heart splinter because she'd promised him truth and stability, and instead was offering more running, more hiding, more uncertainty. Richard appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, Captain Werner supporting him. The king looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time, and Elena watched emotions cascade across Richard's ravaged face. Wonder, grief, Recognition, fear. The resemblance between them was undeniable and heartbreaking. Arthur had Richard's eyes, his bone structure, the same way of holding his head when uncertain. "You're not running." Richard's voice carried an authority that cut through Elena's panic. "Not again. Not while I still draw breath." He moved into the room, and Werner tried to steady him, but Richard shook him off. He knelt before Arthur with visible effort, bringing himself to the child's eye level. "My name is Richard," he said quietly, "and I'm very pleased to finally meet you, Arthur." The boy looked between his mother and this strange, sick man who was staring at him like he was something precious and impossible. "Are you really my father? Mama says you're the king, but you don't look like the kings in her stories." Richard's laugh was broken and beautiful. Kings in stories are never sick or scared or making terrible mistakes. "But yes, I'm your father, and I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I'm so very sorry it took me this long to know you." Elena felt tears burning down her face, felt Catherine's presence in the doorway behind her, felt the weight of 7 years of anger and hurt and desperate survival pressing down on her chest. This moment should have happened differently, should have happened in safety and peace, with time to build trust and understanding. Instead, it was happening in a servant's room while Marcus orchestrated their destruction from the shadows. "We need to move," Catherine said softly. "Get Arthur somewhere secure, somewhere Marcus's people can't reach. Then we face whatever trial he's planning with what evidence we have left." "What evidence?" Elena's voice was raw. "Your documentation is destroyed. The wine sample could be claimed as something I planted. The apothecary is 3 days' ride away, and even if we could bring him here in time, Marcus will paint him as someone I bribed. We have nothing but our word against his, and the court will choose to believe the Lord Regent over 2 women and a dying king. Not nothing." Richard stood with effort, keeping one hand on Arthur's shoulder as if drawing strength from the contact. "We have the truth, and we have each other. 3 people Marcus tried to separate because together we're stronger than he can manage." He turned to Werner. "Captain, I need you to gather every guard. Whose loyalty you trust absolutely. Not those who might be loyal, not those who seem trustworthy, only those you'd bet your life on. We're going to that trial tomorrow, all of us, and we're going to force Marcus to face accusations in public where his performance can be examined by everyone." "Your Majesty, you can barely stand," Werner protested. "The poison has weakened you dangerously. If you try to preside over a trial in your condition, then I'll collapse in front of the entire court. And everyone will see exactly how sick I am. They'll see me struggling to breathe, struggling to stand, and they'll start asking why." Richard's eyes hardened with determination Elena recognized from 7 years ago, before crowns and manipulation had dimmed it. "Marcus has spent years making my illness seem natural, unremarkable. Let's make it impossible to ignore. Let's make every noble in that room wonder why their young king looks like he's dying, while his uncle blooms with health." Catherine nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Visual evidence. The kind that can't be burned or forged or explained away. You want them to see the truth with their own eyes. And I want Arthur there," Richard continued, "standing beside me where everyone can see the resemblance. Let them draw their own conclusions about who this child belongs to. Let them watch Marcus try to explain away a 7-year-old boy who's the image of me at that age." Elena's protective instincts roared against the idea. "No, absolutely not. I won't put him in that room with Marcus, won't make him a spectacle. I want to go." Arthur's small voice cut through her protests. He looked up at Richard with a seriousness that seemed far too old for his years. "If someone hurt my father, if they're trying to hurt my mother, then I should be there. I'm not a baby. I'm 7. That's old enough to be brave." Richard's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder, and Elena saw tears tracking down the king's face. "Yes," he said, roughly. "That's old enough to be brave. But your mother's right to be frightened. What I'm asking, what we're all facing tomorrow, is dangerous. Marcus is cornered, and cornered men are capable of anything. Then we don't give him corners to hide in." Catherine moved to stand beside them. And suddenly they weren't separate people, but something unified and purposeful. We walk into that trial together, king, queen, the mother of his heir, and the child himself. We present a united front, and we dare Marcus to tear it down in front of witnesses. Elena looked at these people, the man who'd destroyed her, the woman who'd survived beside him, the child who'd been made a pawn before he was even born, and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't healing, but it was choice. The choice to fight together rather than be destroyed separately. "Tomorrow then," she said, her voice steady despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. "We end this, one way or another." Arthur slipped his hand into hers, and she felt his small fingers squeeze tight. "Will you tell me about my father?" he asked. "Before tomorrow? I want to know what he was like before he got sick." Richard and Elena's eyes met across the child between them, and 7 years of pain and accusation and desperate love hung suspended in that gaze. Tomorrow would bring trial and judgment and possibly destruction. But tonight, they had this. One small boy who deserved to know he came from something other than betrayal and poison. "Yes," Elena whispered, "I'll tell you everything." The great hall filled with bodies and whispers like a wound filling with infection. Elena stood at the entrance with Arthur's hand clutched in hers, watching nobility file into the space with the practiced grace of people who'd spent lifetimes performing for each other. She recognized some faces from 7 years ago, older now, harder, marked by time and politics. Others were new, young nobles who'd risen during her exile, who knew her only as cautionary tale, the woman who'd tried to trap a king and paid the price. Arthur pressed closer to her side, overwhelmed by the spectacle. He'd never seen this many fine people in one place. The cascade of jewels, the rustle of silk and velvet, the way light caught on gold thread and precious stones. Elena had dressed him in the best clothes they owned, simple but clean, and the contrast between her son's modest linen and the surrounding opulence made her chest ache with protective fury. Richard entered through the king's private door, and the room's energy shifted like a tide turning. He'd refused the formal robes of state, appearing instead in simpler clothes that somehow made his deterioration more visible rather than less. Without the trappings of power to hide behind, everyone could see how illness had carved him hollow. The way he moved carefully as if his bones were fragile, the gray pallor of his skin, the tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control. Catherine walked beside him, and Elena noticed how the queen positioned herself to offer support without appearing to prop him up, maintaining the illusion of strength while providing actual stability. Marcus entered last, and Elena's breath caught because he looked nothing like the dying man from the northern tower. He'd transformed himself into the picture of robust health and wounded dignity, shoulders back, color in his cheeks, moving with the confident stride of someone wrongly accused but certain of vindication. He'd even managed to make his confinement work for him somehow, appearing before the court as a martyr who'd suffered false imprisonment with grace. The performance was masterful and terrifying. Lord Chancellor Brighton called the proceedings to order, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating court politics. He was 70, if he was a day, with white hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Elena couldn't tell if he was Marcus's ally or neutral party, and that uncertainty made her stomach churn. "We are gathered," Brighton announced, "to address accusations of the gravest nature. Lord Regent Marcus stands accused of regicide through poisoning, conspiracy, and manipulation of royal authority. These charges have been brought by Lady Elena of—" He paused, searching for appropriate title. Lady Elena, mother to the child Arthur, and supported by Queen Catherine herself. The way he phrased it was already damaging. Lady Elena, with no house or standing, her only credentials being motherhood to a child whose legitimacy remained unproven, and Catherine's support framed as potentially suspicious rather than authoritative. Marcus stepped forward, and Elena was struck by how he'd weaponized his own vulnerability. "My lords and ladies, I stand before you falsely accused by those who seek to undermine the stability of this kingdom in its hour of weakness. For 30 years, I have served the crown. Faithfully, first my brother, then my nephew, I have asked for nothing but the privilege of service. And now, in my nephew's illness and confusion, I am repaid with accusations that strike at the very heart of my honor." His voice carried perfectly calibrated emotion, hurt but not bitter, confused but not angry, more disappointed than defensive. Elena watched nobles' faces soften with sympathy, watched doubt creep into eyes that had been uncertain. "Your Majesty," Marcus turned to Richard with an expression of patient concern, "I understand that illness clouds judgment, that desperate people seeking advantage might fill your ears with convenient lies. I do not blame you for entertaining these accusations. I only ask that you allow truth to emerge through proper examination of evidence." The trap was elegant. By appearing understanding rather than defensive, Marcus positioned Richard as the one behaving unreasonably. By acknowledging the king's illness, he planted the suggestion that Richard was too sick to think clearly, and by calling for evidence, he was gambling that Catherine's destroyed documentation left them with nothing concrete to present. Richard stood with visible effort, gripping the edge of the raised platform where the throne sat. "Then let us examine evidence. Captain Werner, present the wine sample taken from my private chambers." Werner stepped forward, carrying a sealed crystal decanter, the dark liquid inside catching light like old blood. "This wine was removed from His Majesty's quarters 3 days past and secured under guard. We request it be tested for poison in this assembly's presence." Marcus's expression flickered. Just for an instant, Elena caught something that looked like calculation. "And who removed this wine? Under whose authority?" "Mine," Richard said firmly. "At Lady Elena's urging, when she warned me of possible tampering." "Convenient." Marcus let the word hang. That Lady Elena, returning after 7 years seeking recognition for her alleged child, would suddenly discover poison in wine she herself had access to. How difficult would it be for someone with motive to introduce poison, then present that very evidence as proof of another's guilt? The murmur through the hall confirmed Elena's fears. Marcus's counter-narrative was taking hold. She was the scorned woman with everything to gain from destabilizing the kingdom, from making Richard doubt his uncle, from positioning her son as heir. "Then test it now," Elena heard herself say, her voice cutting through the whispers. "Bring a condemned prisoner from the dungeons. Let them drink this wine before all witnesses. If it's poisoned as I claim, the proof will be immediate. If I somehow tampered with it as Lord Marcus suggests, then I'll face consequences for false accusation." The suggestion was brutal but effective. She watched nobles exchange glances, watched Marcus's face tighten almost imperceptibly. Richard looked at her with something between admiration and horror, understanding what she'd just wagered. If the wine proved harmless, she'd destroyed her own credibility completely. Brighton consulted with 2 other advisors, then nodded slowly. "The suggestion has merit. However, testing with poison takes time. Symptoms may not manifest for hours or days. We cannot keep the court assembled indefinitely waiting for evidence of toxicity." "Then use the royal taster's protocol." Catherine spoke for the first time, her soft voice somehow carrying through the space. "The method used for centuries to protect kings from poisoning. Give the wine to 3 separate animals, a dog, a cat, and a bird. Their smaller bodies will show effects within the hour if poison is present. The court can recess and reconvene when results are apparent." It was a compromise that satisfied no one and everyone simultaneously. Brighton agreed, and guards were dispatched to gather the necessary animals. The hall broke into clusters of conversation. Nobles, speculating and gossiping, building narratives that would shape their loyalties regardless of what evidence eventually emerged. Marcus approached their group with careful concern painted on his features. He stopped far enough away to appear respectful, but close enough to be heard. "Richard, nephew, please. Look at yourself. You can barely stand. This trial is exhausting you further. Let me help. Let me take on the burden of governance until you're well. You can rest, recover, spend time with your queen. I want nothing but your health restored." The offer sounded reasonable, almost loving. But Elena heard the trap underneath. Accept Marcus's help and he'd consolidate power, while Richard continued weakening from poison no one could prove. Refuse and Richard would appear paranoid and ungrateful, turning on the uncle who'd served him faithfully. Arthur tugged at Elena's hand, and she looked down to find her son staring at Marcus with an expression that made her chest tighten. The boy's young face held none of a child's usual uncertainty around powerful adults. Instead, he looked at the Lord Regent with something that resembled recognition, the same instinctive wariness Elena had seen in village children when they encountered dogs that bit without warning. "You're the one making my father sick," Arthur said, his child's voice carrying in a sudden pocket of silence. "You're the bad man Mama told me about." The hall went quiet. Every eye turned to the 7-year-old boy standing between Elena and the king, this child who looked so much like Richard that even skeptics found themselves doing double takes. Marcus's expression cycled through shock, anger, and then calculated sympathy. "Poor child," Marcus said softly, fed lies by a mother desperate to secure position. This is what happens when adults use children as weapons in their political games. "I'm not a weapon." Arthur's voice shook but held firm. "And my mama doesn't lie. She says lying makes you smaller inside, makes you forget who you really are. She says truth is the only thing that can't be stolen." He looked up at Richard with those identical gray eyes. "Are you really dying? Are you really my father?" Richard knelt before his son despite the visible cost, bringing himself to Arthur's level. The movement was so similar to the previous night that Elena felt tears threatening. "Yes to both questions. I am dying slowly from poison I didn't know I was taking. And you are absolutely my son. Anyone with eyes can see it. You have my face, my mother's chin, and apparently her courage as well." He pulled Arthur into an embrace that made the boy stiffen with surprise, then slowly relax. The image they presented, dying king and unknown son, meeting for the first time while the kingdom watched, was more powerful than any testimony. Elena watched nobles' faces shift as they witnessed the resemblance, the emotion, the undeniable connection. Marcus's mask finally cracked completely. This is theater, manipulation, designed to sway hearts rather than minds. A child who's been coached, a woman who's had 7 years to craft her revenge, and a king too ill to see how he's being used. Enough. Richard's voice carried unexpected strength as he stood, still holding Arthur's hand. "The wine will be tested. If it shows poison, we'll trace its source. If it proves clean, we'll pursue other evidence. But I will not stand here and watch you dismiss my son as theater or my judgment as confusion." His eyes locked on Marcus with something harder than Elena had seen from him in days. "I loved you, Uncle. I trusted you with everything after my father died. If you've betrayed that trust, if you've been poisoning me while I clung to you as my only anchor," his voice broke, "then you've killed more than just my body. You've murdered the part of me that believed family meant safety." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted at the hall's entrance. Captain Werner pushed through the crowd, his face grave, supporting a thin man in travel-stained clothes who looked like he'd ridden hard and long. "Your Majesty," Werner called. "The apothecary from the coastal town has arrived. He says he has testimony that cannot wait." The apothecary looked like fear had been eating him from the inside for years. His name was Thomas Ridley, and he stood before the assembled court with hands that shook so badly he had to clasp them together to keep the trembling from showing. Elena had never seen him like this. When she'd found him in the coastal town 6 months ago, he'd been guarded but composed. Now he looked like a man who'd been running from something that had finally caught up to him. "Speak," Lord Chancellor Brighton commanded. "You claim to have testimony regarding these accusations." Ridley's throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes found Marcus across the hall, and Elena saw naked terror flash across his face before he forced it down. "I sold white arsenic to Lord Regent Marcus multiple times over the course of 4 years. Small amounts, carefully measured, disguised in shipments of legitimate medicinal supplies." The hall erupted. Nobles shouted questions. Guards moved to defensive positions, and Marcus's face went through a rapid transformation shock, rage, and then something that looked almost like relief, as if he'd been waiting for this moment and was glad it had finally arrived. "This man is lying," Marcus said clearly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Or has been paid to lie by those who seek my destruction. I've never met this apothecary, never purchased anything from him, never—" "You have a scar," Ridley interrupted, his voice gaining strength from desperation. "On your left forearm, shaped like a crescent moon. You got it as a child from a hunting accident. You showed it to me once when explaining why you needed the arsenic. Said you were studying poisons to better understand how your brother had died, that you wanted to prevent similar tragedies. You made it sound noble, like grief-driving research. I didn't realize until much later that you were actually learning how to replicate the murder." Marcus's hand moved unconsciously toward his left forearm, then stopped. But the damage was done. Every person in the hall had seen that involuntary movement, that confirmation of private knowledge. "Show us," Richard commanded, his voice raw. "Uncle, show the court your arm." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Elena watched calculations racing behind his eyes, weighing options, measuring consequences, deciding which loss was more acceptable. Then slowly, he rolled up his sleeve. The scar was exactly where Ridley had described it, a pale crescent against weathered skin, faded with age but unmistakable. The proof was small but devastating. This apothecary knew details about Marcus's body that only someone with close contact could know. "Coincidence?" Marcus said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "Or information gathered through spies and informants? This proves nothing except that someone has been gathering intelligence about me to manufacture convincing lies." "Then explain the ledgers." Ridley pulled folded papers from inside his coat with shaking hands. "I kept records of every transaction. Dates, amounts, prices paid. They'll match deposits made to my accounts from a merchant house Marcus controls. I've verified these, connections through public records. Every purchase of arsenic corresponds with money transferred from his holdings." Catherine stepped forward, and Elena saw something fierce and triumphant in the Queen's expression. "The financial records I kept, the ones that were conveniently burned yesterday, traced those same transactions. I had duplicated several key pages and hidden them separately, precisely because I knew Marcus would attempt to destroy evidence." She produced a small leather folder from inside her bodice. Not everything burned, not quite everything. The walls were closing in around Marcus, and Elena watched him recalculate in real time. His strategy had depended on there having no concrete evidence, on the trial becoming a matter of word against word, where his authority and long service would prevail. But hard evidence, ledgers, financial records, testimony with verifiable details, was changing the mathematics of belief. "Your Majesty," Werner appeared again, this time accompanied by a guard carrying a covered cage. "The animals, the test results." Brighton nodded gravely. "Present your findings." Werner's face told the story before his words did. All 3 animals showed signs of poisoning within 40 minutes of consuming the wine. The dog died within the hour. The cat and bird are severely ill but may survive. The court physician confirms the symptoms are consistent with arsenic poisoning. The hall went silent except for Richard's breathing, which had gone rapid and shallow. He gripped Arthur's shoulder like the child was the only thing keeping him upright, and perhaps he was. Elena watched her son standing brave and still, trying to understand adult horrors while being used as his father's anchor. "The wine was poisoned," Brighton announced, his voice heavy with the weight of what this meant. "The question remains, by whom and how did it enter His Majesty's private chambers?" "I can answer that." A new voice, trembling and young. "The boy." Guard from the previous night stepped forward, his face blotchy with tears. "I was ordered to deliver special wine to the king's chambers twice weekly. Lord Marcus said it was medicinal, fortified with herbs to help His Majesty's strength. I never questioned it because he was the Lord Regent, because I trusted—" His voice broke. "I helped poison the king. God forgive me, I didn't know, but I helped." Marcus's expression finally shattered completely. The mask of wounded innocence, of loyal uncle, falsely accused, crumbled to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. You're all fools, every one of you. This kingdom was dying under weak leadership. First my brother's sentimental policies, then Richard's naive idealism. I did what was necessary to save us from collapse. I made the hard decisions no one else had the stomach for. Including murdering your own brother? Richard's voice was barely audible. Poisoning your nephew? Destroying innocent people to maintain your grip on power? Including doing what kings should do but rarely have the courage for, putting the kingdom's needs above personal sentiment. Marcus's voice rose, taking on the fervor of someone who'd convinced himself of his own righteousness. Your father was going to make disastrous treaties, was weakening our military, was bankrupting the treasury with charity for peasants who contributed nothing. You were even worse, ready to marry a nobody with no political value, ready to rule with your heart instead of your head. I corrected those mistakes. I saved this kingdom from itself. By murdering us. Catherine's soft voice cut like a blade. By ensuring I remained childless through enforced herbs so you could manipulate succession. By destroying Elena and using a 7-year-old child as a pawn. You call that salvation. I call it pragmatism. Marcus looked around at the horrified faces, and something in him seemed to accept that this was the end, that there was no more point in pretense. Yes, I poisoned the old king. Yes, I've been poisoning Richard. Yes, I fabricated evidence against Elena because she was an obstacle to necessary political alliance. And yes, I would do it all again because the alternative was watching this kingdom tear itself apart under leadership too weak to make brutal choices. The confession hung in the air like smoke from an execution pyre. Elena felt Arthur press harder against her side, felt Richard swaying beside them, felt the weight of 7 years, of pain and struggle and survival finally reaching its conclusion. Brighton's voice shook as he spoke. Lord Regent Marcus, by your own confession and the evidence presented, I declare you guilty of regicide, attempted regicide, and conspiracy against the crown. The sentence for such crimes is death. Marcus laughed, a sound without humor, dark and hollow. Death? I'm 63 years old and have spent my entire life in service to power. I've shaped kingdoms and toppled obstacles and survived by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around me. If I'm to die, at least I'll die knowing I was never weak, never sentimental, never crippled by the kind of love that makes people foolish. His eyes found Elena across the space between them. You should thank me. 7 years of exile made you stronger than you ever would have been playing at noble lady in this suffocating court. I gave you an education in survival that no tutor could provide. You gave me nothing but grief and rage. And 7 years of watching my son ask why his father didn't want him. Elena's voice was steady, cold as winter stone. Don't pretend your cruelty was kindness. Don't rewrite your evil as education. You're a murderer who justified atrocity by calling it pragmatism. And I hope whatever hell awaits you is filled with the faces of everyone you destroyed in service of your ambition. Marcus's expression flickered. Just for an instant, Elena saw something that might have been regret or recognition or simply exhaustion. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold certainty of someone who'd made peace with their own damnation. Richard collapsed. Not dramatically, not with warning. Simply folded like his bones had turned to water. Arthur cried out, trying to hold his father up, and Elena and Catherine both lunged to catch him. They lowered the king carefully to the floor while the court erupted around them, while guards moved to secure Marcus, while physicians rushed forward with supplies that were years too late to matter. Arthur, Richard gasped, his hand finding his son's. You need to be brave now, braver than any child should have to be. Can you do that? Yes, Arthur whispered, tears streaming down his face. I can be brave. Please don't die. Please, I just met you. I'm not. Richard coughed and blood flecked his lips. I'm not dying today. The poison stops now. With treatment, with time, I might recover. Might. He pulled the boy closer. But if I don't, I need you to remember something. This kingdom needs people who are strong enough to be kind, brave enough to be gentle, powerful enough to choose mercy. You have my blood and your mother's courage. That makes you more fit to rule than I ever was." Elena felt something breaking and mending simultaneously in her chest. She met Catherine's eyes across Richard's failing body, and in that moment, they understood each other completely. Two women who'd been used as pawns and had somehow survived to become players instead. "He'll remember," Elena said firmly, "and he'll be better than all of us. Better than you, better than me, better than the kingdom that tried to break us. Because we won't let him forget what love actually means, even when it costs everything." Richard's eyes closed, his breathing steadying slightly as physicians worked around them. Arthur held his father's hand with desperate care, and Elena held her son, and Catherine held them all together through sheer force of will. Marcus was led away in chains, and Elena watched him go without satisfaction or triumph. Just exhaustion. Just the recognition that some victories taste like ash because of what they cost to win. Months later, after Richard had begun the slow recovery that would mark him forever, after Arthur had been formally recognized as Crown Prince, after the kingdom had started the painful process of examining how they'd let one man's ambition poison everything, Elena stood in the rose garden that had finally begun to bloom. Again, Richard found her there, still weak but alive, with Arthur running ahead exploring the flowers with the fearless curiosity of children who don't yet understand how fragile everything is. "I'll never be able to make it right," Richard said quietly. "What I did to you, what I took from Arthur, there's no redemption large enough." "No," Elena agreed. "There isn't. But there's tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days you'll spend teaching our son that love means believing someone even when evidence suggests otherwise, that trust is more valuable than certainty, that mistakes can't be unmade, but choices can be different going forward." They stood in silence, watching their child discover beauty in a garden that had once been their sanctuary and then their graveyard and was now, impossibly, growing back toward something like hope. Elena's story forces us to confront an impossible question. Could you save someone who destroyed you? Could you look into the eyes of the person who publicly humiliated you, who cast you out to die, who made your child fatherless, and choose to rescue them anyway? She didn't return because she'd forgiven Richard. She returned because some truths are more important than personal pain, because a child deserves to know his father, and because letting someone die through your silence makes you complicit in their murder, even when they deserve your hatred. That's the kind of moral courage most of us will never have to face, but all of us wonder if we possess. This story reminds us that the cruelest prisons aren't made of stone and iron. They're built from lies, manipulation, and the slow poison of someone else's ambition. Marcus didn't just try to kill a king. He murdered trust, destroyed love, and twisted an entire kingdom into something unrecognizable. And he did it all while wearing the mask of loyalty, proving that the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who hate you openly, but the ones who smile while slipping poison into your wine. Elena, Richard, and Catherine all survived, not because they were stronger than Marcus, but because they finally chose to trust each other more than they feared being hurt again. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you'd do in Elena's position, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you believe courage sometimes means saving people who don't deserve it. And subscribe because every story we tell here is designed to make you feel something real, something that stays with you long after the final words fade. The greatest stories aren't the ones that give us easy answers. They're the ones that force us to examine what we do when every choice costs something we can't afford to lose.